The desert wind blew slowly across the red sand as the human ship landed with a soft hiss, and silence followed the sound of metal touching the ground because no one had landed here in years, and no one had dared to return since the girl made this place her home and her prison. He stepped out of the ship with slow, careful steps, as if the sand might burn his feet or the air might scream, and he looked around, but saw no welcome and no danger. Only emptiness stretching in all directions, and a strange stillness that made his heart beat louder. His name was Aaron, a soldier once, and a diplomat now sent to meet the girl who had scared the galaxy into silence, and his mission was not to fight her, not to arrest her, not to hurt her, but simply to kneel and speak and maybe survive. The air around him grew heavier with every step forward, as if the planet itself did not want him there, and the sky grew darker, even though the sun still shined, and he knew eyes were watching from far above. From hidden satellites, from orbiting ships, from command rooms filled with silence and sweat, and then she appeared not from behind a wall or out of a door, but from the sand itself, as if the planet gave birth to her, and her long silver hair floated in the wind, and her eyes did not blink, and her skin glowed like fire, trapped in ice, and every part of her screamed danger, yet beauty and fear lived together in her. Shadow Aaron stopped walking, his boots frozen by the weight of her stare, and for a long moment neither moved and neither spoke, and the world held its breath because everyone remembered what happened the last time someone came close to her, and how they vanished without a trace or a scream. He dropped to his knees. It was not weakness or surrender, it was something else, a message maybe, or maybe a promise. But no one understood it, not the generals, not the scientists, not the watchers, and perhaps not even the girl, her head tilted just a little. Emotion so small, yet it felt like a mountain moved, and her lips parted, but no words came, only a strange sound like music made of sorrow and steel. She walked toward him slowly, her feet never touching the ground, as if the earth refused to hold her, and the sky above grew darker though it was still noon, and the wind stopped, and time bent. He kept his eyes down, not out of fear, but out of respect, or maybe because her gaze burned like truth, and he had come not to conquer or lie, but to listen, and maybe to remind her of something she had forgotten. Behind her, the air shimmered like heat waves, and a faint light pulsed there, something ancient and alive hidden just beyond the veil of sight, and he felt it calling him, not in words, but in feeling something broken, something waiting. She stopped a few feet away from him and raised her hand, not to strike, but to hover above his head. And he did not flinch, he did not breathe, and in that moment, something passed between them, something unseen and unsaid. Far above in orbit, generals leaned forward, their fingers tense and sweat on their necks, and one of them whispered, "Why is he kneeling?" And another said, "What is she doing?" And no one had answers, only silence and screens glowing with her face. The girl lowered her hand and then turned her back to him, not in dismissal, but in invitation, and walked away, and he understood her meaning not with his mind, but with something deeper, and so he stood and followed her into the wind. And the unknown, and the cameras kept recording, and the galaxy kept watching, and somewhere in the silence, an old machine lit up for the first time in centuries, and its lights blinked once, and then twice, and deep underground something began to wake the feared girl, the silent warrior, the ghost of 1,000 warnings had not killed the human, and had not rejected him, and the world trembled with questions it was not ready to askand. So began the story of a kneeling man and the girl who no one understood, and a planet that had never known peace, and now dared to hope. High above the ground, in the cold silence of orbit, hundreds of alien eyes watched the human and the girl, and not a single whisper broke the room, filled with generals, advisors, rulers, and hidden watchers who had waited years for this moment, and now no one dared to speak. Screens flickered with her image, her face cold, her body glowing, and next to her the human walked without fear, and though his steps were heavy, his eyes were calm, and everyone watching from space and underground and deep control rooms felt something strange in their chests. Why? "Is she not attacking?" said one voice in the darkness, and another asked, "Why did she let him live?" And a third voice whispered, "Maybe she remembers something, maybe someone," and that voice fell silent quickly because no one liked the thought that the girl who was called the Death Flame once had a heart the girl led. Aaron through a narrow canyon where the wind whispered stories written long ago, and the walls showed old carvings and burned marks and ancient names written in a language forgotten by the galaxy, and Aaron felt as if he was walking through a dream where time moved in circles and not in lines. She stopped at the edge of a stone platform and turned to face him, and her eyes glowed brighter than before, as if something inside her was waking. Something old, something locked, something buried for too long, and she raised her hand and pointed to the ground, and he understood that she wanted him to. Scythe obeyed without a word and lowered himself onto the stone, and the air around them shimmered like heat, though it was cold, and she sat across from him, and a strange hum filled the air like a heartbeat, but not his and not hers. Something deeper, something under the planet itself. For the first time she spoke, but her lips did not move, and her voice came like a whisper in his thoughts, and she said, "Do you know why they fear me?" And he replied in his mind, "No, but I want to know." And she looked at him and said, "Then I will show you." Stone between them lit up with soft blue light, and shapes rose from the surface like water turning into memory, and the air filled with images, sounds, screams, fire, and stars dying. And Aaron saw her past not just as pictures, but as feelings. As if her pain entered his soul, he saw her standing in the center of a war, her hands raised, her voice silent, and armies falling around her, not because she attacked them, but because they attacked her, and the planet had responded to her pain, and it had burned everything in her name. He saw how she begged them to stop, how she tried to save those who came in peace. But they came with greed and hunger, and she had no choice. And when the fire ended, she was alone, and the planet closed itself around her like a shell of sadness, and silence. Aaron felt tears rise in his eyes, not just for her, but for everything that was lost. And she reached out her hand and touched his forehead, and the images vanished, and the stone turned black again. And she said softly, "I did not want to become what they made me." He nodded and said, "I believe you." And she stared at him for a long time, then turned her head and looked at the sky and whispered, "They are watching." And he said, "I know." And she said, "They want to kill you, and I should let them." And he said, "Then why don't you?" She stood slowly and turned away, and said, "Because you are different, and you remind me of someone." And her voice cracked like dry wind across old bones, and he rose and walked beside her and said, "I did not come to judge you." And she replied, "Then why did you come?" He looked up at the darkening sky and said, "To understand you, and to stop the next war before it starts." And she said, "The war already started the moment you landed. And now only the planet will decide if you live or die." Back in the control room's alarms began to flash, and a new signal appeared from under the ground, where no signal had been for 1,000 years, and an old machine spoke in ancient code, and no one could translate it except her. And she smiled slightly when she heard the signal, in her mind show turned to Aaron and said, "The planet is waking, and it remembers your kind, and now it wants to know if you are like them, or if you are truly something new." And she walked forward into the light of the canyon, and he followed her without fear. All across the world, lights began to flicker in old temples and hidden bunkers and forgotten cities, and millions of eyes turned to their screens as the girl and the human walked side by side, and the air grew warmer, and the silence broke, and the world began to breathe again. High above the clouds, a single watcher leaned back in his chair and said, "Perhaps the legend was true." And someone else whispered, "Then we must act before they become hope." And no one answered, because hope was more dangerous than war and more powerful than fear. Dark clouds circled above as the planets spoke in thunder, not with sound, but with pulses that shook the ground, and the girl stopped mid-step, her eyes fixed on the sky, and Aaron felt a strange pressure on his chest, like something heavy had awakened. Something old and watching the air shimmered with golden light, and a voice echoed through the valley, deep and ancient, made of 1,000 whispers layered as one. It said, "Leave now, human, or face what no one has ever survived," and the girl turned her head slightly and looked at Aaron, but said nothing. He stood his ground and did not speak back to the sky, but instead looked into her eyes and asked softly, "What must I face?" And she said, "The first trial is not of strength, it is of truth." And she pointed toward a narrow path carved through red stone, glowing faintly like veins in living rocky. Followed her silently, and every step he took, the wind grew louder and the path twisted like a serpent around cliffs and broken bridges, and strange statues stood along the way, not carved by hands, but shaped by emotion, frozen in stone, pain, fear, hope, and love, all trapped in silence. The end of the path, a circle of stone weighted wide and flat, with symbols glowing faintly. And the girl stepped aside and said, "Enter if you are ready." And he asked, "Ready for what?" And she said, "For the planet, to see who you really are, and to show you what you truly hide on." Walked forward and stepped into the circle, and the light from the symbols rose and surrounded him like fire without heat, and his body froze, not from fear, but from the weight of memory that began to rise from the ground around him like mist, shaped by sorrow. He saw a younger version of himself standing in a ruined village, holding a broken weapon and crying without sound, and around him were those he could not save. Burned homes, fallen friends, silent voices calling from the ashes, and he looked down, unable to face what was now alive again. The girl stood outside the circle, watching without expression, but her eyes showed something deeper, a flicker of understanding, as if she too had walked this path and had seen what cannot be forgotten. And Aaron dropped to his knees as the mist wrapped around him, whispering truths he had buried for years. "Should have done more. I should have been faster. I should have stayed with them." His voice cracked, though no sound escaped, and the circle pulsed once, sending a wave of energy into the ground and far across the planet. Old machines stirred, as if they recognized pain, turned to courage, though. Vision shifted, and now he stood before a mirror that showed not his body, but his choices, every lie, every failure, every moment he chose silence when he could have spoken, and the mirror did not judge it, only reflected, and Aaron raised his hand and touched it without fear. The circle dimmed, and the mist vanished, and the symbols faded, and he stood once more, his face tired but clear, and the girl stepped forward and said, "You passed." And he asked, "What did I pass?" And she said, "The truth test, the hardest trial, because the planet listens to the heart, not the sword." Suddenly the sky above cracked with a golden line, and a second voice spoke. This one colder and sharper, it said. "Strength is still required," and without warning, the ground beneath Aaron trembled, and a shape rose from the earth's metal and rock, fused into a creature taller than 10 men, with eyes burning white and fists like mountains. It charged without pause, and Aaron jumped aside, barely escaping its swing, and the girl did not move, only watched as if this was his fight alone. And he rolled across the sand, grabbed a fallen rod nearby, and stood ready. Though the rod was small and weak, the creature swung again and again, and Aaron dodged, not with speed, but with instinct, each movement guided by something deeper than training, something born from knowing when to run and when to protect. And his body bled from scrapes, but his eyes burned with purpose. Finally, he ran straight toward the creature, slid beneath its legs, and climbed its back, and drove the rod into a small crack near its neck, and the creature roared, not in pain, but in release, and it collapsed slowly, turning into dust and light that scattered into the wind. The girl stepped forward and said, "The second trial is complete." And Aaron stood breathing hard and asked, "How many more?" And she said, "That depends on what the planet sees next." And she reached out her hand and helped him rise, and he smiled faintly and said, "I will not run far above in the control chambers." The watchers stared in silence, and one of them said he faced the mirror and won. And another whispered he faced the guardian and lived, and a third voice trembled, he may be the one. And no one replied for fear they might believe it. Thaw around them changed as the dust from the guardian settled, and the sky above turned quiet as if the planet itself held its breath, waiting for what would happen next, and the girl stood. Still, her silver hair flowing with the wind, her face unreadable like stone shaped by time. Aaron wiped blood from his cheek and looked at her, but said nothing, for he could see something in her eyes. Something that was not there before, a softness mixed with sorrow, and she turned away from him and walked to the edge of a cliff where the ground dropped into a sea of clouds. He followed slowly and stood beside her, and together they looked at the endless sky, and she spoke in a voice so low the wind almost stole it away. She said, "You remind me of him." And Aaron turned to her, but she did not look back, and he asked, "Who was he?" She raised her hand and pointed toward the clouds and said, "He came from the stars like you, and he knelt before me like you. And he looked at me not with fear, but with faith. And the world was different than not safe, but not broken." And her voice trembled on the last word, waited and did not interrupt, because he knew she was not just speaking to him, but to something inside herself that had been silent for too long. And she said his name was Kale, and he was not a warrior, he was a healer. He came not to take, but to give, and he taught me to trust. He asked what happened to him, and her lips pressed tight, as if holding back a scream, and she said, "They took him because he stood beside me and not against me, and they feared his voice because it reached to many hearts, and they silenced him with fire, and made me the monster they needed." The sky rumbled faintly as if echoing her pain, and Aaron felt a weight on his chest, not from fear, but from the truth that now lived between them, and he asked, "Why did you stay?" And she said, "Because he believed this planet could still change, and because his last words were, 'Do not give up.'" She stepped forward and placed her hand on a stone that glowed faintly under her touch, and suddenly the ground opened, revealing a staircase made of glass leading into the earth, and she said, "Follow me if you want to see what they buried." And he nodded and walked with her into the darkness. The stairs spiraled deep into the planet, and strange lights flickered along the walls, showing carvings of stars and ships and beings made of light. And Aaron realized this place was older than any history he had known, and the girl said, "This is the heart of the planet, the place where memory sleeps." They reached a chamber wide and cold, with a pool of still water in the center, and above it floated a crystal sphere, spinning slowly and glowing with soft blue light. And she said, "This is the memory stone. It holds the truth of what happened and why I became what I am." She touched the sphere, and it pulsed, and the room filled with images of fire and screams of towers falling and skies bleeding red, and the girl standing alone in the middle, her hands shaking, her voice crying for peace, and ships raining destruction from the sky, while voices ordered silence from above. Ron watched as the image of Kale appeared, holding her hand, standing before a crowd and speaking of unity and change. And the crowd listened until soldiers came and fire followed, and the girl screamed as he was taken, and the light in her eyes turned from warmth to storm. The vision faded, and the chamber went quiet, and Aaron stood still, his hands trembling, and he said, "They lied to the galaxy, they blamed you for what they did." And she said, "Yes, and I became the mask they created, because no one wanted the truth, only someone to fear." He walked to her and placed his hand over hers and said, "I believe you." And she looked at him with eyes that no longer glowed with anger, but with something gentler, and said, "You are not like the others." And he said, "Maybe because I carry my own pain." Suddenly the chamber shook, and a red light flashed across the walls, and she turned quickly and said, "They know we are here, and they are coming, not to question, but to end what they started." And Aaron looked up and said, "Then we show them the truth before they silence us again." Far above the planet's alarms rang in the control rooms, and orders were shouted, and ships began to move And the watchers prepared for war, not knowing that the truth had already begun to rise from the deep, and that the planet itself had started to remember. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they climbed out from the chamber of memory, and the wind above howled louder than before, as if the planet itself was angry or afraid or both, and the sky had turned dark, not with clouds, but with ships, black and silent, now floating above them, like a warning written across the heavens. Aaron looked at the girl, and she looked at the sky, and both understood what was about to happen, and she said, "They come not for truth, not for answers, but for control." And silence, and he said then, "Let them see what they fear, because silence will not save them any more." The wind split as a massive ship landed on the cliff behind them, and from its cold metal belly came rows of armored soldiers, faceless and wordless, with weapons humming softly, and behind them walked a tall figure in a silver cloak, whose voice cut through the air like ice through fire, and he said, "Step away from the human girl, this is your last mercy." The girl did not move, and the ground beneath her glowed faintly, as if the planet stood with her, and the tall figure raised his hand, and the soldiers aimed. And he said, "This is treason and death," and the girl replied, "This is truth and memory and fire," and she stepped forward, her hair rising with energy as the air around her began to sing. I stood beside her and said, "If you shoot, then shoot both of us, because I kneel for her, not for you." And the tall figure laughed without sound and said, "So be it," and the soldiers raised their weapons higher, and the girl whispered, "I will protect you," and he replied, "Not alone." The first shot never came because the ground beneath the soldiers cracked open, and a wall of crystal rose between them, glowing with the same light as the memory stone, and a voice older than all echoed across the sky, and it said, "The judgment begins now, and the planet has awakened them." Soldiers stepped back, confused, and the tall figure shouted fire. But their weapons did not work, and their feet would not move, and the wind grew stronger until it became a storm of voices, voices of the past, of those lost, of those betrayed, and the girl stood tall and said, "Hear them." Now from the clouds came shapes glowing with pale light, not spirits, not machines, but something between, made of energy and memory, and one by one they floated before the soldiers, showing them the truth of what happened long ago. The lies, the fire, the silence, the pain, and the cost. The soldiers dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, and the tall figure screamed and turned to run, but the planet would not let him, and roots of light wrapped around his legs and pulled him to the ground, and the girl walked toward him slowly and said, "Your voice brought death to love, and your hands wrote lies on stone, but no more." He looked at her and said, "What are you?" And she said, "I am what you made, and what you feared, and what you could never destroy, because I am the voice of the forgotten and the fire of the silent, and today I speak not alone." And behind her stood Aaron, eyes bright with truth and heart filled with courage. Suddenly the sky cracked open again, and a beam of golden light struck the ground between them, and another ship landed, not from the enemy, not from the past, but from a new alliance, a group of beings, both human and alien, who had seen the broadcast from the memory stone and had come to stand for peace. They stepped out with empty hands and open hearts, and one of them spoke, "We come not to rule, but to listen." And the girl looked at Aaron and said, "Perhaps hope still lives." And he said, "It always did, only hidden beneath fear and dust, and now we let it grow." The planet pulsed once, and the wind softened, and the light returned, and the crystal wall lowered slowly, and the soldiers stood quietly now, unsure of what to do. And the girl looked at them and said, "You are not my enemies. If you choose truth over silence," and they lowered their heads, and Shamaran stepped forward and raised his hand and said, "The past does not vanish in light, but we choose whether it lives as pain or as strength. And today, we choose strength through truth and the crowd." Around them began to form people from hidden places, from bunkers, from caves and cities, now walking into the light. Drawn by the voice that had been buried for years, the girl looked across them all, and for the first time, she smiled, not with victory, but with peace, and the ground beneath her bloomed with flowers of light, and the sky opened wide and clear, and the planet whispered its approval in wind that felt like a song sung in a forgotten language. The sun returned to the sky with gentle warmth, as if the planet itself had taken a deep breath and released the weight it carried for ages, and the girl stood silent among those who now looked at her not with fear, but with something softer, something closer to understanding, walked beside her, and felt the air shift again, not with danger, but with purpose, and he turned toward the glowing hills. In the distance, where an old signal had just awakened, and the girl said the hidden chamber has opened, it was sealed the day they silenced Kale, and no one has stepped inside since that moment. They began their journey through fields of stone and sky filled with light, and as they walked, more joined them, humans and aliens side by side, moving not as soldiers, but as seekers of something buried beneath lies and history. And silence. The path was long and carved by time, with symbols lost to most eyes but not to hers, and she traced each one with her hand and whispered, "This is the language of the planet, the words that speak to the roots and to the stars." And Aaron listened with the quiet of someone learning to hear. Again they reached a valley where the wind moved in circles and the ground was smooth as glass, and in the center stood a tower of dark crystal pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, and the girl placed her hand against it and said, "This is the Eye of Origin, and it holds the first memory of the planet." The tower opened slowly with a sound like breath held too long, and a warm light spilled from within, revealing a chamber untouched by time, filled with floating spheres of soft blue and golden threads that danced between them like living stories waiting to be read. She walked into the chamber, and the spheres followed her movement like children returning to their mother, and Aaron stepped in behind her and saw images inside the spheres, stories of the beginning of when the planet welcomed both stars and sky, and when peace lived without fear. One sphere floated before him and showed Kale standing with leaders of many worlds, proposing a truth council, a system where no voice would be lost, and the girl stood beside him not as a weapon, but as a bridge, and Aaron whispered, "So this was the dream. They killed the girl." Nodded slowly and said they feared the truth because it would end their control and bring power to the people, and so they erased history and turned me into a shadow and Kale into a forgotten whisper, and then sealed this place and made it Mithrin stepped forward and reached into the sphere, and suddenly his body shivered as the full story entered him. And he saw what they did, how they twisted her image, how they used fear to build empires, and how they told the galaxy that peace was impossible without war. He fell to his knees with tears in his eyes and said, "They turned you into a warning when you were the hope." And she said, "I carried their darkness so others could live, and I waited not for revenge, but for someone to believe in more than survival." Suddenly, one of the spheres turned red and pulsed wildly, and the girl gasped and said, "This is new. This is not part of the old memory. This is a live recording." And they watched as a face appeared on the surface, a face they both knew, the tall man in the silver cloak. Now speaking to leaders across systems, he said, "The planet is unstable, the girl is dangerous, and the human is compromised." And he demanded a full strike before the truth spreads further, and the leaders listened with tired eyes, and fear and hesitation and silence that screamed louder than words stood and said, "Then we must show them what truth really is, not in whispers, not in secret chambers, but in the open sky." And the girl said, "The planet agrees." And the tower pulsed again, and from its top rose a beam of golden light that shot into space, carrying the pure memory of all that had been hidden, every lie, every silence, every twisted truth, now released across the stars and the galaxies, received the light on screens and devices, and in the hearts of those who still dared to hope. And the voice of Bruce and the voice of Kale returned not as a ghost, but as a flame that refused Two Die people watched and cried and screamed and asked why they were lied to, and in homes and cities and stations across the universe. The seeds of rebellion began to bloom, and leaders began to fall as voices rose, not in war, but in truth, back on. The planet the girl stepped out of the chamber and looked at the stars and said, "It has begun," and Aaron looked at her and said, "Not war, but change," and she replied, "Yes, and this time we do not fight alone," and he reached for her hand and she took it. Without fear, the planet hummed softly, and trees began to grow in places once dry and broken, and birds returned to the sky, and rivers sang again, and the world began to heal, not just from scars of war, but from the silence that had chained its soul. The sky above turned gold as the light of truth reached every corner of the stars, and the silence that once ruled the galaxy now broke into 1,000 voices, speaking with hope and with strength, and the girl stood at the top of the hill with Aaron beside her, both watching the ships that once came to destroy now land in peace. The leaders who once ruled through fear now walked with heads lowered and eyes open, and they did not come with weapons, but with empty hands, and they did not speak orders but questions, and for the first time in many years they listened instead of commanded. The people of the planet gathered in numbers too many to count, and stood across valleys and hills and cliffs, their faces turned toward the two who had broken the chains of silence, and they waited not for war, not for rule, but for a path forward that was born from truth, not power. No, not power. Not power. No, not power. Looked at them and remembered the days she stood alone when her voice was lost and her heart burned with sorrow. And now she saw not fear in their eyes, but something softer, something like trust, something she never believed she would feel again. Aaron stepped forward and raised his voice and said, "We are not here to lead alone. We are not here to build thrones or walls. We are here to build bridges with truth as our foundation and memory as our guide." And the people listened not because they were forced, but because they believed. One by one survivors came forward, those who lived through the fires, those who carried stories in their scars, and they told the truth that had been buried under orders and lies, and the ground received their pain, and the sky held their words, and the planet whispered back with wind that healed instead of harmed. The girl walked among them, not as a goddess, not as a weapon, not as a legend, but as one of them, and children reached for her hand, and elders bowed with quiet tears, and she smiled. Not because she won, but because she was seen and heard, and accepted. Ships arrived from other worlds carrying those who had seen the memory light across the stars, and they came not as visitors, but as kin. They brought seeds of peace and songs of healing, and they asked how to help, how to share, how to begin again together. They built not monuments to power, but gardens that grew from shared soil, and halls where all voices could speak, and schools that taught not just knowledge, but kindness and truth, and everywhere the past was remembered, not as shame, but as lesson. Tall man in the silver cloak was brought before them, not in chains, but in silence, and he looked at the girl and said, "You should destroy me," and she said, "I could, but I choose to forgive, not for you, but for those who come after." And she turned away, leaving him with his own reflection. Aaron stood at the heart of the gathering and said, "We kneel not to rulers, not to fear, not to war. We kneel to truth, and to each other, and to the future. We now shape with hands, not stained with blood, but open and ready." And the crowd answered with voices united in peace. The planet responded with color and sound, and life returned to the corners once broken, and the trees whispered songs in forgotten languages, and rivers glowed with soft light, and the sky danced with stars that moved as if rejoicing in the night. The girl and Aaron sat beside a small fire under a sky that now felt like home, and she said, "I never thought this day would come," and he replied, "Neither did I, but here we are." And she said, "Do you think they will keep the peace?" And he said, "Only if we keep reminding them why it matters." She reached for his hand, and he held hers gently, and for a long time they said nothing, only listened to the planet breathe. and the stars hum, and the future take its first steps in silence, filled with hope, far away in a distant part of the galaxy. A young child watched the memory light and asked their mother, "Who is she?" And the mother smiled, and said, "She is the girl who once was feared by all, and loved by none, until one man knelt not in weakness, but in truth, and done." The child asked what happened next, and the mother said, "They changed the world not with force, but with understanding, not with power, but with belief, not with weapons, but with pull." With hands held together, and the child smiled and whispered, "Then maybe I can too." The girl, once called a weapon, once called a curse, once called alone, now walked among her people with her name spoken, not in fear, but in love, and the man who knelt, now walked beside her, not as a savior, but as a friend, and together they built what had never been built before. World where memory was not hidden, a world where truth was not punished, a world where peace was not a dream, but a choice made every day. By every voice, and the stars watched in silence as the new world began, and the planets smiled in wind and rain and sun and song.